The case against rationality from an atheist. Hi, guys. This is Britt Hartley at No Nonsense Spirituality. I'm an atheist spiritual director, and this episode is going to be about the shadow side of rationality, even as someone who's very anti woo, anti superstition, anti supernatural. And I'm going to start by turning to Stephen Fry for this question to help you discern if you are a rationalist or an empiricist. So, Stephen Fry asks this question: do you think that the President of the United States should ritualistically go up to the statue of George Washington once a month and explain to George, the statue, all the things that you accomplished or fought for that month as president? Now, a pure rationalist would say there's no reason to do that. It's a statue. There's no point talking to it. George Washington isn't there. But an empiricist is more likely to say, I would like the president to do that because I think there's value in the experience of a president having to justify his actions to George Washington's statue, even if it is just a statue. There's something in the ritual of it, in the experience of it, that has value. Another example that Stephen Fry uses, who is an empiricist over a rationalist, is he talks about the famous case of Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian physician in the 19th century who discovered the importance of hand washing in reducing infant mortality rates. So in the 1840s, Semmelweis worked at the Vienna General Hospital, where he noticed a stark difference in the maternal death rates between two maternity wards. One ward was run by doctors and medical students and had a high infant mortality rate due to fever, childbed fever, and the other ward, run by midwives, had a much lower mortality rate. So Semmelweis investigated and realized that doctors were performing autopsies on corpses before delivering babies without washing their hands. And he hypothesized that there was some kind of particle that was being transferred from the dead bodies to pregnant women, causing infections. Now, remember, this is before germ theory. So he introduced mandatory hand washing stations with this kind of lime solution, and mortality rates dropped dramatically. However, because germ theory was not yet understood, doctors in the medical establishment rejected his findings, seeing them as an attack on their profession and their professional pride. And because Semmelweis couldn't provide a rational explanation for why hand washing worked, since bacteria hadn't really been discovered yet, many of the doctors simply stopped washing their hands, and mortality rates rose again. So he was dismissed from the Vienna General Hospital, and he was facing widespread opposition. He published his findings in 1861, where he was largely ignored because he had no way to explain what was happening. And he began lashing out at his critics and writing angry open letters, kind of condemning the medical community for going back to not washing their hands when he had solid evidence that this was causing an increase in infant mortality. His behavior became so unstable because he was so frustrated that his colleagues and his wife started to believe that he was suffering from mental illness. Super sad story. So in 1865, Semmelweis was tricked into entering an insane asylum in Vienna. And when he realized what was happening, he tried to escape, but he was beaten by the guards and forcibly restrained. He died 2 weeks later from an infected wound, ironically caused by the very unhygienic conditions that he was trying to fight against. So Stephen Fry has referred to this case in discussions about empiricism versus rationalism. Rationally, there was no reason to believe at that time that washing your hands would reduce infant mortality rates. But empirically, experientially, it was somehow true. But rationalists shut it down because they couldn't yet explain it, and infant mortality went back up, and Semmelweis died in an asylum. So, I mean, super sad. Now, I will tell you that I'm never going to ask you to leave rationality at the door. That's not what this is about. That's not where I'm going with this. I was raised Mormon, and in order to survive in Mormonism, you have to shut off your rationality, and I am never doing that to myself again. But after spending a long time in the rational, philosophical, nihilistic, atheistic spaces, I also want to point out the weaknesses of rationality and what we miss when it's the only tool in our toolbox. So I have 5 weaknesses that I want to share that I think hold rational people back from living a more full life. So weakness number 1, many people turn to rationality as a security blanket. This truth hurts me. This is painful. Because when I was in philosophy and theology in these very male dominated fields, I really believed that rationality was far superior to things like feelings that I knew could be manipulated because I'd been a Mormon before. And what I didn't realize is a lot of my own trauma was pushing me towards pure rationality because it felt safe. My mom was an emotionally erratic person. Mormonism certainly gave me trauma. I was kicked out of my home at 16. So my brain subconsciously said, if I can just rationally figure out what's going on with reality, then I can pattern my life correctly and then I won't fuck my life up. And what I didn't realize at the time was how much trauma was driving me towards that stance and how safe rationality felt for me. And the harsh truth that I've had to tell many rational truth seeking clients who only want to live by, propositional knowledge is that they make fun of people who who turn to religion in order to have some kind of security blanket. But so often the reason that especially men turn to rationality as if they are some kind of robot is also because it feels safe. It is also being used as a security blanket and also makes you feel better than other people. And that in many ways makes us hypocrites. Weakness number 2. There are more ways of knowing than propositional knowing. Alex Connor gives a great example of this where someone is suicidal on a ledge. And if we were purely rational creatures, you could simply hand them a piece of paper with a perfectly reasoned argument against jumping off the ledge. Like, you are experiencing cognitive distortions. Your suffering is temporary. There are people who care about you. Logically, there's more to gain by stepping back than by jumping. And if humans were only propositional thinkers, this argument should work, just like solving a math problem. But that's not how humans are. That's not how we operate. Instead of logic, imagine instead that someone reads them a poem that deeply resonates with them, that speaks to their sufferings, that makes them seen, or perhaps someone just looks you in the eye and says, I understand. This non-propositional knowing, emotional connection, shared experience, shifts in perspective actually has more of an effect of pulling them back from the edge than just by giving them some kind of logical proof. So there are other kinds of knowing other than just propositional knowing. And propositional knowing is just knowledge in the forms of statements or facts. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. This is the kind of knowing used in logic and science and everyday factual claims. But there is procedural knowing, like knowing how to do something, like riding a bike or playing an instrument. It's skill-based and it's learned through practice rather than theory. There's perspective knowing, where you know what it feels like to be in a certain situation, such as experiencing love or fear. This type of knowing shapes how we perceive and interact with the world. It's how you perceive it. There's participatory knowing. That's a deep lived connection to reality, like the bond between a dancer and a dance or a person in their environment. It's the kind of knowing that emerges from direct engagement rather than detached observation. So when we try and pretend that we are robots who only act based on propositional statements of philosophy, we're kidding ourselves. That's not the kind of primates that we are. And the danger I see in many highly rational types who often end up in nihilism is their body is just the thing that moves their head from room to room, and they've forgotten how to do, how to be, how to experience, how to perceive, how to explore. And that is one way that people end up in nihilism or a meaning crisis, because they're only looking for propositional ways in order to build a life. And nihilism kind of takes all of that, which can leave highly rational types very depressed. Weakness number 3, ignoring the power of story, narrative, ritual, and symbolism. This is where atheists, and I know atheism is just a negation, but I'm talking about the culture of atheism, the actually guy at the party who has an identity built around atheism. They often ignore the power of story to the human mind. Humans are deeply ritualistic creatures. Even the most rational atheist still engages in symbolic behavior, whether they recognize it or not. Take the example of funerals. A strict rationalist might say that person is dead. There's no logical reason to gather around a box and say words and throw dirt on it. They're gone. But rituals aren't for the dead. They're for the living. They provide a framework for processing grief and making sense of loss and communal support. And rationality alone cannot replace the need for human rituals ritual, and societies that abandon rituals often find themselves in a meaning crisis. So something like meditation or storytelling might not seem rationally necessary, but they serve deep cognitive and emotional functions for our brains. The failure to understand the power of ritual is why many rationalists end up feeling spiritually starved without knowing why, but they can't step into spirituality because their rational brain just kind of is tearing it apart, and they're not experiencing the power of ritual and story and symbolism. Any therapist will tell you that if you experience a death or loss, you can read 1,000 books on how to process grief, but it won't matter if you skip the funeral. So sometimes our aversion to woo and superstition, which I understand and I support, but it can keep rational atheist types from the narratives and rituals and symbolism that can help you move emotions through your body or support a conversation between your conscious and subconscious mind. Richard Dawkins, for example, said recently that dream work was, and Jung archetype stuff is gobbledygook. And he's right. It's not a hard science. It is not a hard science. But I've got to tell you, working with symbolism and archetypes that show up in my dreams gives me a lot more information about myself. When I have the recurring dream that I show up in a high school history class with no lesson plan prepared, I know that my anxiety is high. And when I wake up, I try to prioritize some way to bring my anxiety down. Or there was a time where I had a dream where it was clear that I was doing some kind of bullshit in my relationship, something that my conscious mind wasn't aware that I was doing. But it came up in my dream and I was able to bring that to the surface and deal with it. Or even just for fun, going to a tarot night with girlfriends and playing with the symbols on cards and sharing what it brings up in you. Sure, it's stupid and they're just cards, but I learned something deeper going on in a friend's life that I care about and that has value to me. And the symbolism was a medium for that. Funerals, stories, mythology, symbols, dreams, art, archetype, narrative, dance, ritual. These things are deeply impactful for our brains and really help us engage with life. Even if we can't put a ritual into a beaker and say this amount of ritual is good for you, all we can say is that the science tells us it's good for you. Scientifically, with rituals, we can reduce pain, increase pleasure, process emotion, and mark values through ritual. The science is clear on that, but science won't tell you what story will change something in your being or what ritual will help you feel closer to your grandma. You need something more than rationality for these kinds of questions. You need to dive into emotions and story. Two resources for that kind of work is Elaine de Botton and Nick Jankel. They're both atheists who yell at atheists when they are missing something or when their eyes just kind of glaze over at the mere mention of the word, spirituality or symbolism. So I really recommend their work on that. They are both great for calling out atheist culture for what they're missing, essentially. Weakness number 4, you are far more irrational than you are rational. The only true rational stance is to recognize how irrational we are. We know from science that we are often emotional first, and then we add rationality second. For example, the political party that you found yourself drawn to was first an emotional connection or a connection to your core values, and then you added reasons and rationality later. Any apologist in any religion, they are an apologist because they equally studied each religion and logically chose the one that made sense, and all the other ones didn't. They had an emotional connection first to some way of life or some way of looking at the world or community, and then they added rationality later. So many rationalists assume that their thinking is immune to bias because they are logical, but rationality is a double-edged sword. It can be used to seek truth, or it can also be used to justify anything that we emotionally want to believe. So, for example, think about how, incels use rational arguments to justify their worldview. They collect data points about dating trends, and they kind of twist evolutionary psychology to fit their narrative. And they use very logical sounding arguments to prove that women are shallow and that society is stacked against them. They believe that they are being rational, but in reality, they are using rationality to reinforce their own emotional wounds and biases. And this happens all the time. People use logic to rationalize bad behavior, justify cruelty, or defend indefensible positions. Rationality, when divorced from intellectual humility and emotional intelligence and self-awareness, really becomes a tool for self-deception rather than truth-seeking. Thinking that you're just rational is to be incredibly self-deceptive to your own biases and narratives that underlie the rationality that you add later. And we know this even from split brain studies, where you tell one half of your brain to drink the juice, and then you ask the other half of your brain, why did you do that? And without missing a beat, you'll say, oh, I love juice in the morning. You'll give a rational reason for why you did something that actually had nothing to do with why you're doing it. And the brain does this all the time without you even knowing it. So you can't start with a world of rationality for all your decisions, because first you have to define what you value. And that's going to be an experiential and intuitive and emotional place more than purely logical. Weakness number 5, living from the point of view of experience is going to give you a lot more meaning in life than living from a place of pure rationality. Again, this one hurt me. One of the reasons I was stuck in nihilism for so long was because I was searching for a rational reason to justify existence, and there really isn't one. Nothing that I do will matter in the end. I will be forgotten in 3 generations. That is a fact. In a million years, there will be no record of even my species in this cold corner of the universe. That also appears to be a fact. And rationally, I don't have free will. See my free will episode. I don't really want to go into that right now. And so rationally, there's no way to pick one kind of life over another, because how am I supposed to find meaning when there's an infinite number of paths and no way to choose one over the other? And ultimately, it doesn't matter anyway. This is where I was stuck, because I was so dependent on rationality. I didn't know that there was any other way to live. The biggest shift that I ever made in my nihilism was the shift into experience. What does this meat suit like to experience? What values resonate with this meat suit the most? What stories make me cry and do I feel in my bones? What narratives change the way that I see the world, like the first time I saw Les Mis? What's it like to dance when no one is watching? What's it like to try mushrooms? What's it like to experience love? What kinds of experiences get me into a flow state where time and my body and my mind are in this state of oneness, where I'm totally immersed in something? What kinds of conversations just light me up from the inside out? This shift into experience, that I also have a whole episode on, but it really saved my life, because there was no way to build a life of meaning when I'm just a monkey on a planet that will eventually blow up or run into the Andromeda galaxy, and there'll be no record of any of this. I couldn't build meaning from that place. Rationality doesn't fully understand experience. It can try to put words to it, but the chemicals going on in your brain when you're in love is very different than the experience of being in love, for example. And I missed out on a lot of experiences worth having when I was only a head walking from room to room. So for me, at No Nonsense Spirituality, I've had times in my life where I've had to shut rationality down. I was an apologist for Mormonism, for God's sakes, where I had to use incredible, like gold medal mental gymnastics to rationalize how God could work through a treasure digging polygamist in 1830 to bring about the one true gospel. I had to absolutely repress the rational side of me to make that work. And I've also swung to the other side. I've had time as a stone cold atheist who didn't touch anything that had the stench of woo or emotion or symbolism or soft science or intuition or any of that. I just wanted the cold hard facts. And I shut down the value of experience and the wisdom of my body. And so now what gives me the most wholeness and joy and inner peace is that I don't have to shut down my rational side. I'm going to take that with me. I'm never going to force myself to believe in things that are unbelievable. I'm just not going to do that. But I also recognize that I'm not just rational. I have core values and intuition and gravitate towards story and narrative. And there's so many things to experience that I get value in just for the sake of the experience. And I truly believe that this approach to life, or this approach to spirituality, gives you the best bang for your buck, because you get so many tools and people to connect to and experiences worth having without the dogma or the culting or the bullshit. So this past week, I was in Hawaii with my family. I do labyrinth work when I'm there. It's a ritual that can help you support a conversation between your conscious and subconscious mind on your way to the middle of this maze. You just ask yourself what's going on underneath the surface of your attention. You know, what's going on with me at my depths? And you just kind of see what pops into your mind. And then you spend some time at the center of the labyrinth, and that's just kind of your center. It's representative. And on the way out, you start thinking, how do I want to better connect to the world outside of me? And you just allow whatever thoughts for that pop into your conscious mind from your subconscious. It's a very connective experience. no woo, no beliefs. And I also visited the oldest Christian church when I was there. I will sometimes go to a Tongan Mormon ward because the men sing there in a way that I've never heard, especially men, sing. I'll have a debate with the Jehovah's Witnesses at the beach because I just can't help myself. I talked to a guy on the beach about his faith journey, and I just briefly connected with a stranger. I went to a bookstore and bought a book about Pele and learned about the divine feminine and Hawaiian traditions, and how rich her character was. And I went to a Buddhist shop and I bought a little sign about impermanence. And the Buddhist who ran the shop talked to me for a while, and I asked him how he learned about impermanence and what he's lost. And he told me a story of all the things that he's lost along the way. And I met another Buddhist at a temple, and I invited him to coffee because I heard in his New York accent. And he used to be the CEO, doing cocaine with strippers in Vegas. And then he found Buddhism and left it all. And now he's just happily sweeping the steps with no possessions at all. And that was just in 1 week. But in that 1 week, I met wonderful people. I did some inner work. I was inspired. I connected deeper to myself and connected outside of myself. And I don't have to believe in astrology. I don't have to believe that Jesus is coming again, or in a God, or in manifesting, or in human design, or that Bashar is talking to aliens, or reincarnation. I don't have to believe in any of it. I don't have to believe in truth claims about things that we just don't know enough about yet in order to experience a life that is meaningful and even spiritual. So that's my invitation to you to follow me here at No Nonsense Spirituality, where we will always keep rationality at the table. I will never ask you to believe anything that is unbelievable, but it isn't the only tool in the toolbox, because there's far more to life than just being a body that takes your head from room to room. That's it for me, folks. Hang on for next week. Next week, I'm going to be doing an episode on how an enlightenment journey or spiritual journey can differ between men and women. So stay tuned for that. And thanks for listening. Bye.